The mountains remember what men forget. Through ancient valleys carved by glacial whispers, where winter holds dominion 6 months of the year, a lone figure tends his flock. Snow falls like ash from a dying star, blanketing the world in silence. Here, at the edge of civilization, a shepherd with war in his eyes and scars on his soul seeks escape from humanity. But the universe has a peculiar way of finding those who wish to disappear. Sometimes salvation comes not from what we understand, but from what lies beyond our stars. In the eyes of a stranger who falls from the heavens, wrapped in silence and mystery. Mason Everett had always preferred the company of sheep to people. It wasn't that he hated humanity. He'd seen enough of that during his 3 tours in the Centauri conflict. No, it was more that humanity had a way of disappointing him, of reopening wounds he'd rather let scar over. So when his service ended, he didn't return to the bustling megacities of the eastern seaboard or the sprawling agricultural communes of the Midwest. Instead, he purchased a small plot of land in the northern Rockies, as far from civilization as credits could buy. The government still controlled most of the mountain ranges after the resource wars, but they were willing to lease parcels to veterans, a gesture of goodwill that cost them nothing and provided the appearance of caring for those who'd fought their battles among the stars. Mason didn't care about the politics. He just wanted quiet, and sheep were quiet. Mostly. On this particular morning, as winter tightened its grip on the mountains, Mason trudged through knee-deep snow, counting his flock with practiced efficiency. 27, all present and accounted for. The specially engineered Highland sheep were resilient to the cold air, their wool genetically modified to provide superior insulation. Mason pulled his thermal coat tighter around his broad shoulders as the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of another storm. His cabin stood a quarter-mile away, a simple structure of reclaimed wood and modern insulation, solar panels on the roof nearly obscured by snow. Smoke curled from the chimney, the AI home system maintaining the optimal temperature in anticipation of his return. It wasn't much, but it was his. No commanders barking orders, no politicians deciding which colony world deserved protection and which could be sacrificed. Just Mason, his sheep, and the mountains. He was halfway back to the cabin when he noticed the tracks. They weren't animal prints. He knew every predator species in these mountains. They weren't human either, at least not entirely. The stride was too long, the imprint in the snow unlike anything he'd seen before. Mason's military training kicked in immediately, muscles tensing as adrenaline flooded his system. He whistled for Argos, the shepherd drone that helped him with the flock. The small hovering device appeared instantly, awaiting instructions. "Perimeter scan," Mason ordered, his voice rough from disuse. "Full spectrum." The drone beeped in acknowledgement and rose higher, its sensors sweeping the area. Mason reached into his coat and wrapped his fingers around the handle of his pulse pistol. Most shepherds carried them for protection against wolves and mountain lions. Mason kept his for different predators, the kind that sometimes found their way to Earth, despite the coalition's stringent immigration policies. Argos returned quickly, projecting a holographic display that showed a heat signature about 200 yards east, partially obscured by a rock formation. The signature was weak, indicating either a small creature or one whose core temperature was dangerously low. "Maintain flock security," Mason told the drone. "Alert if approach within 50 yards. He moved cautiously through the snow, decades of combat training guiding his steps. The wind had picked up, reducing visibility as fresh snowflakes began to fall. Mason kept his eyes on the terrain, noting that the strange tracks became more erratic, as if whoever or whatever had made them was struggling to move forward. As he rounded the rock formation, he saw it. A small figure curled into a fetal position in the snow. For a moment, Mason thought it was a child, but as he drew closer, he realized his error. The proportions were wrong, limbs too long, torso too narrow, and the skin visible where a makeshift cloak had fallen away was not human skin at all, but a pale lavender hue with a subtle pattern that reminded him of frost on glass. An alien, on Earth, in his mountains. Mason's grip tightened on his pistol. The Centauri conflict had officially ended 3 years ago, but tensions remained high. Most extraterrestrial species were banned from Earth, except in designated diplomatic zones. If this creature was here illegally, it meant trouble, the kind Mason had moved to the mountains to avoid. But as he stood over the figure, weapon ready, it stirred and turned its face upward. Mason found himself looking into eyes that were entirely black. No whites, no visible iris, just depthless obsidian pools. The face was almost human in structure, but more delicate, with high cheekbones and a pointed chin. It appeared female, though Mason knew better than to apply human gender concepts to alien physiology. What struck him most, however, was the expression in those alien eyes. Fear. Raw. Universal. Unmistakable fear. Mason had seen that same look in the eyes of civilians on colony worlds, in the faces of children as evacuation ships departed without them, in the mirror on nights when the dreams were too vivid to distinguish from memory. He knew fear, recognized it across the boundaries of species and language. The alien attempted to scramble backward, pushing weakly against the snow with limbs that trembled from cold or exhaustion or both. A sound escaped her, not words, but a whimper that needed no translation. Mason holstered his pistol slowly, holding his empty hands up in a universal gesture of peace. "Easy," he said, though he doubted she understood English. "I'm not going to hurt you." The alien stopped moving, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She was young, Mason realized, not a child perhaps, but not fully mature either, and she was injured. Now that he looked more carefully, he could see dark fluid, the color of wine, seeping through the crude bandage on her right leg. He had two choices: leave her here to die, or take her back to his cabin. The first option was simpler, safer. If anyone discovered he was harboring an alien, especially one from a species that might have fought against Earth in the conflict, the consequences would be severe. His veteran status wouldn't protect him from charges of treason. But Mason had seen enough death in his lifetime. He'd been responsible for enough of it. "Fuck it," he muttered, then knelt in the snow. "I'm going to help you," he said, gesturing to her injury and then to himself. "Help. Understand?" The alien remained perfectly still, those black eyes studying him with an intensity that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. Then, slowly, she nodded. It was enough. Mason moved forward carefully and lifted her from the snow. She weighed less than he expected, her body almost weightless in his arms. The alien went rigid at his touch but didn't struggle. Up close, he could detect a faint scent from her skin, something like ozone and wildflowers. "Argos," he called. The drone appeared instantly. "Guide the flock back to the pen. Secure the perimeter. Full alert protocol." As Mason carried the alien toward his cabin, snow began to fall more heavily, quickly covering their tracks. By morning, there would be no evidence of the strange encounter, no sign that an illegal visitor had fallen from the stars into his solitary world. Just fresh snow on the mountains, pristine and secret. He didn't know then how much his life was about to change, how the silence between them would grow into understanding, how the words she would eventually speak would alter everything he believed about the universe, about the war, about himself. Mason only knew that, for the first time in years, he had made a choice that wasn't about survival or obligation. He had chosen compassion, and somewhere deep inside, in a place he thought had died on a battlefield light years from Earth, he felt something stir, the faintest flicker of his humanity rekindling. The cabin's warmth enveloped them as Mason shouldered his way through the door, the alien still cradled in his arms. The home AI system registered the additional presence immediately, but thankfully lacked the sophistication to identify species, small mercies. "Increase interior temperature by 5 degrees, Mason instructed as he gently set the alien down on his couch. She remained tense, those black eyes darting around the cabin, cataloging escape routes and potential weapons with a thoroughness that Mason recognized from his own military training. "You're safe here," he said, unsure why he bothered speaking when she couldn't understand. "I need to look at that wound." He pointed to her injured leg, then to his first aid kit on the wall. The alien followed his gesture, then returned her gaze to his face. After a moment's hesitation, she moved her hand away from the wound, giving him silent permission. Mason retrieved the kit and knelt beside the couch. The bandage covering her injury was made from a material he didn't recognize, something like fabric, but with metallic threads woven throughout. He carefully peeled it back, revealing a deep gash about 6 inches long. The edges were cauterized, likely from some kind of energy weapon. Mason had seen enough plasma burns during the war to recognize one. She was a fugitive then, or a deserter. Either way, someone had tried to stop her, and she had fled to Earth. Of all the planets in the Coalition, she had come to the one most hostile to her kind. "This needs proper treatment," Mason muttered. He selected an antiseptic spray and a regenerative gel from the kit. The spray was formulated for human physiology, but the gel was a military-grade product designed to work on various species. A souvenir from his service days that he'd never expected to use again. "This might sting," he warned, showing her the canister before applying it. The alien tensed but made no sound as the spray coated her wound. She watched with evident curiosity as he applied the gel, her head tilted slightly to one side. As he worked, Mason took the opportunity to study her more closely. Her clothing was unlike anything he'd seen before, not military issue from any faction he recognized. The fabric seemed to shift colors subtly with her movements, from deep purple to midnight blue. Her hair, if it could be called that, was more like fine silver filaments that moved with an almost liquid quality. And there was something about her features, a symmetry that was both beautiful and unsettling. She belonged to the Lissari species, he realized with a jolt. A reclusive race that had remained neutral during the Centauri conflict, despite pressure from both sides to join the war. Very few humans had ever seen a Lissari in person. They were rumored to possess powerful psionic abilities, though military intelligence had never been able to confirm this. What was a young Lissari doing on Earth, alone and injured? Mason finished bandaging her leg and packed away the medical supplies. "You need food, water, and rest, Anne," he said, pointing to his kitchen and then the spare bedroom. "Then we figure out what to do with you." The alien watched him stand, her expression unreadable. Mason moved to the kitchen, aware of her eyes following his every movement. He filled a glass with water and returned, offering it to her with a gesturing motion of drinking. She took the glass carefully, her slender fingers, 4 on each hand, he noticed, wrapping around it with deliberate precision. She sniffed the water first, then took a small sip. Finding it acceptable, she drank deeply, draining the glass. Mason refilled it twice more before she seemed satisfied. Food was more complicated. He had no idea what Lissari ate, or if his supplies would poison her. He settled for offering various items one at a time. An apple, dried meat, bread, a protein bar. She accepted the apple and the bread, examining each carefully before taking tentative bites. The meat and protein bar she declined with a subtle shake of her head. Night had fallen completely outside, the storm howling against the cabin walls. Mason's mind raced with questions and concerns. He should report her presence to the authorities. That was the law. But laws had seemed increasingly meaningless since returning from the war, where he'd witnessed the Coalition's supposedly ethical principles bent and broken repeatedly in the name of victory. The alien had finished eating and was now examining the bandage on her leg with delicate touches. She looked up at him suddenly, those black eyes seeming to see through his skin to something beneath. She placed a hand over her heart, then extended it toward him. A gesture of gratitude, Mason assumed. "You're welcome," he replied with a nod. "We'll figure this out in the morning. You need rest." He showed her to the spare bedroom, a small space he used mainly for storage. The bed was clear at least, though he rarely bothered to keep sheets on it. He quickly made it up while the alien stood in the doorway, watching his movements with that same intense curiosity. "Sleep," Mason said, miming the action. "I'll be out there." He pointed toward the main room. "You're safe." He didn't know why he kept repeating that last part. Perhaps he needed to convince himself as much as her. Having an illegal alien in his home was about as far from safe as Mason could get. The alien moved to the bed and sat on its edge, running her hands over the blanket's texture. She looked up at Mason and nodded once, a gesture so human it momentarily startled him. "Good night," he said, and closed the door. Back in the main room, Mason poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey and drank it in one swallow. The liquor burned down his throat, a familiar fire that did nothing to warm the cold knot of anxiety in his stomach. He checked the security feeds from Argos, confirming that the perimeter remained secure, no sign of pursuit. Yet, Mason settled into his armchair facing the bedroom door, his pulse pistol within easy reach. He didn't expect trouble from his guest, but old habits died hard. He'd sleep lightly, as he always did, as the war had taught him to do. As exhaustion began to overtake him, Mason wondered what the hell he was doing. He'd come to the mountains to escape complications, to live a simple, solitary life far from the politics and conflicts that had defined his existence for so long. Yet here he was, harboring a fugitive alien, risking everything he'd built for himself, because of a look in her eyes, because of fear he recognized, because some part of him, a part he thought had died on Proxima Centauri 4 alongside his squad, still responded to another being in distress. Mason drifted into uneasy sleep, haunted by dreams of black eyes and battlefields, of choices made and unmade. He woke at dawn, his body alert before his mind fully processed why. Someone was moving in the kitchen. Mason reached for his pistol in one fluid motion, then remembered his guest. He relaxed slightly, but kept the weapon close as he rose and moved quietly toward the kitchen. The alien stood at his counter, examining the coffee maker with evident fascination. She turned as he entered, those black eyes reflecting the morning light streaming through the window. She looked better this morning. Her lavender skin had a healthier glow, and she stood without favoring her injured leg. "Good morning," Mason said, setting his pistol down but keeping it within reach. "I see you found the kitchen." The alien pointed to the coffee maker, then to Mason, her head tilted in question. "Coffee," he explained, moving to the machine. "Caffeine. Probably not good for your system." He prepared his morning coffee while the alien watched with intense interest, tracking his every movement. When the rich aroma filled the kitchen, she inhaled deeply, her silver filament hair rippling in what Mason interpreted as pleasure. "Want to try?" he asked, pouring a small amount into a separate cup. "Just a taste." She accepted the cup carefully, sniffing the liquid before taking the smallest possible sip. Her reaction was immediate, a full-body shudder followed by a sound that might have been a laugh. She returned the cup to Mason with a definitive shake of her head. "Not for everyone," Mason chuckled, surprised by the ease of the interaction. It felt almost normal. This quiet morning routine shared with another being. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed, even at something so small. After breakfast, fruit and bread for her, eggs and coffee for him, Mason faced the question he'd been avoiding. What now? She couldn't stay here indefinitely. Sooner or later, someone would come looking for her, or his monthly supply delivery would arrive, or any number of complications would arise. "We need to figure this out," he said, gesturing between them. "Who you are, why you're here, what you're running from." The alien regarded him steadily, her expression serious. She seemed to understand the gravity of his words, if not their exact meaning. After a moment's consideration, she rose from the table and moved to the window, pointing up at the sky. "Space, yes. You came from up there. But where? And why Earth? Why here?" She turned back to him, frustration evident in her delicate features. Communication was the immediate problem. Without a shared language, they were limited to gestures and guesswork. The alien suddenly straightened, an idea visibly forming. She pointed to the dirt on his boots by the door, then made a sweeping motion with her hands. "Dirt? Floor?" Mason guessed, confused. She shook her head, then pointed more specifically to a small patch of soil that had dried and fallen from his boot. She pantomimed writing or drawing. "Ah," Mason understood. "I want to draw something." He found paper and a pencil in a drawer, actual paper, a luxury in the digital age, but Mason had always preferred tangible things. The alien took them eagerly and sat at the table, beginning to sketch with surprising skill. First, she drew a star system, not Earth-Sun, but a binary system that Mason recognized immediately, Lyceria, the homeworld of her species. Then she added several planets, focusing particularly on the fourth one from the twin suns, She drew a small figure, herself, Mason assumed, and then several larger figures surrounding her. One of these she emphasized with darker strokes, adding what looked like a weapon in its hand. "You're in danger," Mason interpreted. "Someone specific is after you." She nodded vigorously, then continued drawing. The next image showed her in what appeared to be a small spacecraft, moving away from her homeworld toward a system that Mason recognized as Earth's. She drew a line from space down to a mountainous region, his mountains. "You came here deliberately," Mason said slowly. "Not by accident. You were looking for something." The alien set down the pencil and looked directly at him. She pointed to the figure representing herself, then to Mason, then back to her drawing. She circled a specific part of the mountainous region she had drawn. Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. "You were looking for me, for this place." She nodded, her expression intensely serious. Then she turned the paper over and drew a new image, a circle with intricate patterns inside it. Mason recognized it immediately, though he hadn't seen one in years. A coalition military medallion, specifically the one awarded to the survivors of the Proxima Centauri IV campaign. The medal he'd thrown into a drawer the day he'd been discharged, vowing never to look at it again. "How do you know about this?" Mason demanded, his voice hardening. "How do you know who I am?" The alien didn't flinch at his tone. Instead, she drew another figure next to the medallion, another Lissari, but older. Judging by the additional details she added to the face, she connected this figure to herself with a line, then drew a universal symbol that needed no translation, a DNA helix. "Family," Mason said. "This Lissari is your family. Parent. Sibling." She placed her hand over her heart, then raised it above her head, a gesture Mason interpreted as indicating respect, perhaps authority. "Father? Leader?" She nodded at the first suggestion, then continued drawing. The father figure now appeared alongside human soldiers, one of whom wore the medallion. The scene depicted was unmistakably a battlefield. Mason's heart began to race. "Your father was at Proxima Centauri IV. That's impossible. The Lissari were neutral. They never—" He stopped, as understanding dawned, cold and clear as the mountain air outside. The official history of the war, the narrative fed to soldiers and civilians alike, had never quite made sense to those who fought on the ground. The sudden retreat of the enemy forces at Proxima Centauri IV, the mysterious intelligence that had saved Mason's squad when they were cut off behind enemy lines, the unexplained transmissions that had guided them to safety. "Your people helped us," Mason whispered. "In secret. Against the official position of neutrality." The alien nodded slowly, her black eyes never leaving his face. She drew one final image, the father figure being confronted by other Lissari, weapons pointed at him, then a smaller figure, herself, fleeing to a ship. "They found out," Mason said. "Your father was discovered. He helped coalition forces, helped my squad, and when it was discovered, he was punished." He looked up at her, seeing her in a new light. "So and now they're after you too." She placed her hand flat on the drawing of Mason's mountains, then on her heart, a plea. "Sanctuary," Mason translated. "You came here for sanctuary." The alien nodded once more, then did something unexpected. She reached across the table and placed her hand over Mason's. Her skin was cooler than human temperature, smooth like polished stone. The touch was brief but deliberate, a connection across species, across the vast gulf of space and experience that separated them. Mason withdrew his hand, uncomfortable with the sudden intimacy. His mind was racing, trying to process the implications of what he'd learned. If she was telling the truth, and his instincts told him she was, then she represented a direct link to one of the most classified chapters of the Centauri conflict. Her presence on Earth wasn't just illegal immigration, it was potentially explosive political information that could destabilize the fragile peace between worlds. "This is bigger than me," Mason said, standing abruptly. "I can't—" He paced the small confines of the kitchen, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "I'm just a shepherd now, not a soldier. Not anymore." The alien watched him, her expression patient. She seemed to understand his turmoil, giving him space to process this revelation. Mason stopped pacing and looked at her directly. "What's your name? Do you have a name I can pronounce?" The alien tilted her head, considering the question. She pointed to herself, then made a series of soft clicks and whistles that Mason had no hope of replicating. "Right," he sighed. "I'll just call you—" He glanced outside at the snow-covered landscape that had delivered her to him. "Snow. I'll call you Snow." The newly named Snow seemed to accept this designation with a small nod. "And I'm Mason," he added, pointing to himself. "Mason Everett." Snow repeated his name, her pronunciation perfect despite her earlier inability to speak. "Mason." Her voice was melodic, with a quality that reminded him of wind through crystal. Mason stared at her in shock. "You can speak. You understand English." Snow shook her head, then pointed to her ear, then to her mouth, making a connecting gesture between them. Some kind of mimicry ability, Mason realized. She could repeat sounds, but didn't necessarily understand their meaning. "Great," Mason muttered. "So we're still stuck with drawings and charades." Snow returned to her sketching, seemingly determined to communicate something else. This time, she drew what appeared to be a communication device, then a series of coordinates beneath it. "You have a transmitter. You need to send a message," Mason guessed. Snow nodded, her expression becoming urgent. She pointed to the coordinates, then up at the sky, then made a sweeping motion with her arms that Mason interpreted as many or more. A cold feeling settled in Mason's stomach. "There are more of you coming. More Lysari seeking sanctuary." Another nod, more emphatic this time. "How many? When?" Snow held up her hand, all 4 fingers extended. 4 more. She then drew a crude lunar calendar, circling a date approximately 2 weeks from now. 4 more Lysari, coming in 2 weeks, Mason translated, and you need to send them a signal, let them know it's safe to land, or not safe. He eyed her carefully. "Which is it, Snow?" "Is it safe here?" Snow met his gaze steadily. She pointed to him, then made a motion of weighing something in her hands, her expression questioning. The message was clear. "That depends on you." Mason turned away, moving to the window to stare out at the snow-covered mountains. His mountains. His refuge from a war that, apparently, wasn't as finished with him as he'd thought. "I came here to be alone," he said quietly. "To forget. To just tend my sheep and live out my days in peace." He glanced back at Snow, who was watching him with those depthless black eyes. "But you knew that, didn't you? Your father knew my squad. Knew me. That's why you came here specifically, to my piece of nowhere." Snow didn't respond, but her silence was answer enough. Mason sighed heavily, his breath fogging the cold glass of the window. 2 weeks. "We have 2 weeks to figure this out." Outside, the morning sun glinted off fresh snow, bright and unforgiving. Somewhere beyond the blue of Earth's sky, others like Snow were preparing to flee, to seek safety on a planet that officially considered them enemies. And Mason, who had fought so hard to escape the complexities of war and politics, found himself once again at the center of a conflict that transcended planetary boundaries. But this time, perhaps, he was on the right side from the beginning. The next few days established a tenuous routine. Mason continued his work with the sheep, maintaining appearances in case anyone happened to pass by. An unlikely event in the depths of winter, but Mason had survived by being cautious. Snow remained inside the cabin, her natural curiosity leading her to explore every corner of his modest home. She seemed particularly fascinated by his books, physical books, another anachronism Mason preferred to digital alternatives. Communication improved gradually. They developed a rudimentary sign language, supplemented by drawings when necessary. Mason learned that Snow was what humans would consider a young adult, somewhere in her early 20s by Earth reckoning. Her injured leg healed with remarkable speed, the advanced regenerative gel accelerating her natural recovery. On the 4th day, Mason brought out his old military trunk from beneath his bed. He hadn't opened it since arriving in the mountains, preferring to leave the past locked away. Snow watched with solemn interest as he keyed in the biometric lock. Inside lay the remnants of his former life, his uniform, folded with military precision, medals he'd never wanted, the official documentation of his service record, heavily redacted, and a small box containing personal effects from fallen comrades that he'd promised to keep safe. Coalition Marine Corps, Mason explained, showing Snow his service insignia. Recon unit. We specialized in hostile environment operations. Snow nodded, recognizing the symbols from her father's drawings. She pointed to a specific medal, the Proxima Centauri Campaign Star, and then made a series of gestures that Mason had come to understand meant story or explain. Mason hesitated. He rarely spoke about the war, even to himself in the darkness of sleepless nights. But Snow had risked everything based on what her father had told her about him. She deserved to know what kind of man she had placed her trust in. Proxima Centauri 4 was supposed to be a standard extraction mission, he began, his voice rough with disuse. Intelligence reported a research facility with high-value assets that needed recovery before the enemy could destroy them. My squad was sent in, 12 of us. He paused, memories surfacing like corpses in still water. It was a trap. The intelligence was manufactured. We were cut off, surrounded by enemy forces that outnumbered us 20-1. No extraction possible. We took shelter in an abandoned mining complex, determined to sell our lives dearly. Snow watched him intently, her black eyes reflecting the dim light of the cabin. 3 days in, running low on ammunition and supplies, we received an encrypted transmission, navigation data, enemy positions, a safe route out. We thought it was from command, a miracle rescue. We followed it, moving only at night, and it led us through enemy lines to a securable position where extraction became possible. Only later did we learn that Coalition Command had written us off as lost. The transmission came from somewhere else. Mason looked directly at Snow. From your father? Snow nodded solemnly, placing her hand over her heart in what Mason had come to recognize as a gesture of deep respect or remembrance. 7 of us made it out alive, Mason continued. 5 didn't. The official report cited exceptional tactical decisions and lucky breaks. None of us corrected this narrative. We couldn't explain the transmission without raising questions no one wanted answered. He closed the trunk, sealing away the physical reminders of his past. After that mission, things changed. I started seeing patterns in our intelligence, inconsistencies in official explanations. I started asking questions. My commanding officers suggested I was suffering from PTSD, recommended psychological evaluation. When my service term ended, I wasn't offered renewal, so I came here. Snow reached out hesitantly, her slender, 4-fingered hand hovering above his arm. Mason nodded once, giving permission, and she placed her cool palm against his skin. The gesture was simple but profound, acknowledgement of shared understanding across the gulf of their differences. Your father saved my life, Mason said quietly. I guess I owe him a debt. Snow shook her head, making a sweeping gesture that dismissed the concept of debt. Then she pointed to Mason, to herself and outward to the stars, bringing her hands together in a motion that suggested unity or common purpose. Maybe, Mason replied, unconvinced. But harboring 4 more alien refugees goes beyond repaying a debt. It's treason against the coalition. If we're discovered. He didn't need to finish the thought. The penalties for harboring illegal extraterrestrials were severe. Life imprisonment at minimum, execution if the aliens were deemed hostile. The fact that the Lissari had technically been neutral during the conflict wouldn't matter. Earth's government had become increasingly xenophobic since the war's end, viewing all non-human species with suspicion. Snow seemed to sense his conflict. She moved to the window, looking out at the mountains with an expression Mason couldn't quite interpret. After a long moment, she turned back to him and made a series of gestures indicating that she could leave, find another solution. No, Mason said firmly. That's not an option. You wouldn't survive out there alone, and if you were captured, he shook his head, we stick with the plan. 2 weeks to prepare, to secure a landing zone, to figure out how to communicate with your people when they arrive, one problem at a time. Snow nodded, relief visible in her delicate features. She made the sign for work and pointed to herself, asking how she could help. First, We need to establish more reliable communication, Mason decided. Then we need to modify my transmitter to send a signal your people can recognize. After that, we need to prepare the cabin for 4 more guests. It's going to be crowded. As they began working on these tasks, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. It was uncomfortable, almost painful, like blood returning to a limb that had fallen asleep. He didn't want this responsibility, this connection to a conflict he'd tried so hard to leave behind. Yet as he watched Snow carefully disassemble his communications equipment, her slender fingers working with precise efficiency, he couldn't deny the strange sense of rightness that had settled over him. For better or worse, his solitary existence had been disrupted, and there would be no returning to the simple life he had constructed for himself among these mountains. The universe, it seemed, wasn't finished with Mason Everett. A week passed, marked by steady progress and growing understanding between the unlikely companions. Snow proved remarkably adaptive, learning human customs and routines with keen observation. She began to assist Mason with the sheep, her natural affinity for the animals surprising him. The flock accepted her without hesitation, unlike their typical wariness around strangers. Their communication system evolved rapidly. Snow's species possessed an eidetic memory, allowing her to memorize English words after hearing them only once. She couldn't form complex sentences yet, but her vocabulary grew daily. Mason found himself talking more than he had in years, naming objects and explaining processes simply for the pleasure of watching her mind absorb the information. "Mountain," he would say, pointing to the peaks visible from the cabin window. "Mountain," Snow would repeat, her pronunciation flawless, the word stored perfectly in her memory. They modified Mason's communications array, combining his military knowledge with Snow's understanding of Lissari technology. The resulting hybrid system was crude but functional, capable of transmitting a narrow-band signal that would guide her people to a landing zone several miles from the cabin. "Safer this way," Mason explained. "If anyone detects the signal, it won't lead directly to us." Snow nodded her understanding, adding a final adjustment to the transmitter. "Good thinking," she said, the phrase one she had picked up from Mason and now used with precise timing. On the 8th day, as a winter storm raged outside, they sat before the fireplace sharing a simple meal. Mason had discovered that Snow could eat most earth vegetation, but had strong negative reactions to processed foods and any form of meat. Her diet consisted primarily of fruits, vegetables, and certain grains. She particularly enjoyed apples, consuming them with evident delight. "Why Earth?" Mason asked, a question that had been troubling him. "Of all the planets in the galaxy, why come here? Your people must have known how dangerous it would be." Snow set down her half-eaten apple, considering how to respond with her limited vocabulary. She made a series of gestures indicating vastness, then restriction, then hiding. "Earth is the last place anyone would look for Lissari," Mason interpreted. "Because it's so obviously hostile to your kind." Snow nodded, then added, "Father say, Mason Everett. Good man. Trust." The simple statement hit Mason with unexpected force. Trust. Such a small word for such an enormous concept. He hadn't trusted anyone since the war, perhaps not even himself. "Your father had more faith in me than I deserve," Mason said quietly. Snow shook her head firmly. "No. See true." She pointed to her black eyes, then to Mason's heart. "See inside. No." Before Mason could respond, a shrill alarm cut through the cabin's warmth, the perimeter alert. Someone was approaching. Mason was on his feet instantly, the soldier in him responding before conscious thought. "Hide," he ordered Snow, pointing to the cellar access beneath the kitchen floor. "Now!" Snow moved with urgent grace, disappearing into the hidden storage space while Mason grabbed his coat and weapon. He checked the security feed from Argos, identifying a single heat signature approaching from the Valley Road, the only access point during winter. A government skimmer by the profile, military grade, coalition. Mason's mind raced as he secured the cellar door and arranged a rug over it. No sign of Snow remained in the main living area, but the modified communications array sat prominently on his workbench. No time to hide it. He took a deep breath, forcing his features into the neutral expression he'd perfected during interrogation resistance training. Then he opened the door just as the skimmer landed in the clearing before his cabin. A tall figure emerged, bundled against the cold in a coalition uniform. The insignia identified a major in Intelligence Division, not someone who would typically make social calls on retired veterans in remote mountain regions. "Major?" Mason called out, his voice carrying across the whipping snow. "Bit far from headquarters, aren't you?" The officer approached, snow crunching beneath military boots. As they drew closer, Mason recognized the face beneath the thermal hood. Major Diana Voss. They had served together briefly before her promotion to intelligence. "Everett," she greeted him, her expression professionally neutral. "Still hiding from civilization, I see." "Not hiding," Mason corrected, maintaining his casual tone with effort. "Living." "There's a difference." Voss smiled thinly. "May I come in? This storm is picking up." Mason hesitated only briefly before nodding. Refusing would raise suspicions, and Voss already had the authority to enter whether he consented or not. Better to appear cooperative. "Coffee," he offered as she removed her outer gear, revealing the sleek black uniform beneath. "Please," Voss replied, her keen eyes already scanning the cabin's interior. Mason felt a surge of anxiety as her gaze passed over the communications array, but she made no comment. "Nice setup you have here. Very self-sufficient." Mason busied himself with coffee preparation, his back to her as he replied, "That's the idea. What brings intelligence all the way out to the middle of nowhere, Major? Sheep smuggling ring you need to break up." Voss chuckled, the sound devoid of genuine amusement. "Always the comedian, Everett. Even in the worst situations." She accepted the offered coffee mug, her eyes never leaving his face. "Actually, I'm here on a matter of planetary security." "Sounds serious," Mason commented, leaning against the counter with forced casualness. "What does that have to do with me?" Voss sipped her coffee before answering. 3 days ago, our deep space monitoring stations detected an unregistered craft entering Earth's atmosphere. Lizari design. Mason kept his expression neutral, though his heart hammered against his ribs. Lizari. They were neutral in the conflict. "Officially," Voss agreed, though there were always rumors, inconsistencies in the intelligence. She fixed him with a penetrating stare, particularly surrounding certain operations, like Proxima Centauri IV. Mason returned her gaze steadily. "Ancient history, Major. I was just a grunt following orders. Were you?" Voss set down her mug and moved to the window, looking out at the storm. The craft crashed somewhere in this mountain range. Given the weather conditions, we've been unable to locate it precisely, but our projections suggest it was heading in this general direction before we lost track of it. "Lot of mountains out there," Mason observed. "Lot of places to crash." "Indeed," Voss agreed. "Which is why we're checking in with all registered residents in the area. Seen anything unusual, Everett? Lights in the sky? Unexplained tracks in the snow?" Mason shook his head. "Just sheep and the occasional wolf. Been a quiet winter." Voss turned from the window, her eyes now fixed on the communications array. "That's an interesting modification to standard communications equipment. Military grade, but customized." Mason's mouth went dry. "Hobby of mine. Signals better for reaching supply stations during storms. Mind if I take a look?" Without waiting for permission, Voss moved toward the workbench. Mason intercepted her, positioning himself between the Major and the array. "Actually, I do mind. That equipment is registered to me, modified within legal parameters, and unless you have a warrant specifically for it, I'd prefer you respect my privacy." Voss's expression hardened. "Awfully protective of a hobby project, Sergeant." "Civilian now," Mason corrected. "And yes, I value my privacy. It's why I live out here." They stood in tense silence, the unspoken challenge hanging between them. Mason knew he was taking a risk, but allowing her to examine the array would expose its non-human modifications instantly. After a long moment, Voss's posture relaxed slightly. "Very well, civilian Everett. Keep your secrets and your privacy." She retrieved her outer gear, preparing to leave. "But know this, That craft was carrying at least one Lissari, possibly more. They are considered hostile infiltrators until proven otherwise. If you see or hear anything, you are legally obligated to report it immediately. Understood, Mason replied evenly. At the door, Voss paused, looking back at him with an unreadable expression. You know, some of us always wondered about Proxima Centauri 4, how your squad survived when the mission was clearly compromised. The official report never quite satisfied. Mason held her gaze. Sometimes luck favors the desperate, Major. Perhaps, Voss conceded, or perhaps there were other factors at play, factors that might explain why a Lissari craft would head toward this particular region of Earth. She pulled up her hood against the storm. See, food for thought, Everett. I'll be watching this area closely. After she departed, Mason waited a full 30 minutes before retrieving Snow from the cellar. She emerged pale and trembling, having understood enough of the conversation to recognize the danger. She knows, Snow whispered, her limited vocabulary conveying the essential fear. She suspects, Mason corrected, but she has no proof. Yet. He paced the cabin, mind racing. We need to move up the timetable. Your people can't land here now. The area will be under surveillance. Snow's expression fell. No safe place. Mason stopped pacing, a dangerous idea forming. Maybe there is, but it means leaving the mountains, risking exposure. He ran a hand through his hair, weighing impossible options. There's an old military bunker about 50 miles south, decommissioned after the war, officially abandoned. I did a rotation there before my discharge. I know the security systems, the layout. Coalition there? Snow asked, her black eyes wide with concern. No, not anymore. But it has a landing pad designed for stealth craft, shielded from orbital sensors. If we can reach it, secure it, your people could land there undetected. Snow considered this, then nodded decisively. When go? Tonight, Mason decided, as soon as the storm passes. We'll take my all-terrain vehicle. It's slow but reliable in snow. We need to reach the bunker before your people arrive, and before Voss decides to return with a warrant. As they prepared for the journey, gathering supplies and erasing evidence of Snow's presence, Mason felt the weight of his decision. He was committing fully to this course now, not just harboring a single alien refugee, but actively facilitating the illegal entry of others. If caught, there would be no leniency, no consideration of his service record. Yet as he watched Snow carefully pack the few possessions she had acquired, a book she was using to learn English, a small carving of a sheep Mason had made for her, he knew he couldn't choose differently. For reasons he wasn't ready to examine too closely, her safety had become essential to him. "Ready?" he asked, as the storm's fury began to subside outside. Snow nodded, determination replacing fear in her delicate features. "Ready, Mason." They left the cabin under cover of darkness, the only home Mason had known for years disappearing into the swirling snow behind them. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the very real possibility of failure. But for the first time since the war, Mason moved forward with clarity of purpose, the burden of isolation lifted by the presence of the silent alien beside him. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The journey south was slow and treacherous. Mason's all-terrain vehicle crawled through snowdrifts and navigated narrow mountain passes, its treads finding purchase where wheels would have failed. Snow sat beside him in the passenger seat, her black eyes reflecting the vehicle's dashboard lights as she watched the wilderness pass by. "Cold," she commented, pulling Mason's spare thermal coat tighter around her slender frame. "Lissari homeworld is warmer," Mason asked, keeping his eyes on the treacherous path ahead. Snow nodded. Twin suns, always light. She gestured to the darkness surrounding them. This, strange. Mason tried to imagine a world without night, perpetually illuminated by binary stars. No wonder Snow found Earth's winter darkness disorienting. They traveled in companionable silence for several hours, the vehicle's heating system struggling against the bitter cold outside. Mason's thoughts kept returning to Major Voss and her thinly veiled accusations. The official narrative of the Centauri conflict was unraveling, and Mason found himself at the center of a truth too dangerous to acknowledge. Dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. Mason checked their position on the navigation system, still about 20 miles from the decommissioned bunker. He pulled the vehicle into the shelter of a rock formation, cutting the engine. "Rest here," he explained to Snow. "Few hours. Continue when dark." Snow tilted her head, questioning. "Why wait?" "Less visible at night," Mason replied. "Less chance of being spotted from aerial patrols." They ate a cold meal of ration bars and dried fruit. Mason had brought enough supplies for 3 days, hoping they wouldn't need them all. The bunker would have emergency provisions if it hadn't been completely stripped after decommissioning. As Snow dozed in the passenger seat, Mason kept watch, his military training reasserting itself with practiced ease. The stillness of the mountain morning brought unwelcome clarity to his thoughts. He was risking everything, his freedom, possibly his life, for Snow and her people. Why? A debt to her father, some misplaced sense of atonement for the war, or was it something simpler, more fundamental, the basic human instinct to protect another being in need? Perhaps it didn't matter. He had made his choice, and soldier that he was, he would see the mission through. Snow stirred beside him, her silver filament hair catching the light as she straightened. "Mason," she said, her voice carrying an unusual urgency. "Listen." Mason tensed, straining his ears. At first, he heard nothing beyond the whisper of wind over snow. Then he caught it, the faint but distinctive hum of a skimmer engine, growing steadily louder. "Down," he ordered, pulling Snow lower in her seat as he slumped down himself. "Don't move." Through the vehicle's tinted windows, they watched as a coalition patrol skimmer passed overhead, its searchlights sweeping the terrain below. It was flying a standard search pattern, methodical, thorough, looking for something or someone. The skimmer passed directly over their position, its engines vibrating the air around them. Mason held his breath, knowing their vehicle's thermal signature would be visible to military-grade sensors, despite its civilian camouflage. Their only protection was the rock formation, providing partial cover from above. The skimmer hovered momentarily, then continued its pattern, moving away toward the north. Mason released his breath slowly. "That was too close," he muttered. "They're expanding the search area. We need to move faster." He restarted the vehicle and adjusted their route, plotting a course through deeper valleys where tree cover might provide additional concealment. It would add miles to their journey, but increase their chances of remaining undetected. As they resumed their slow progress, Snow watched the sky warily. "More come." "Probably," Mason admitted. "Voss isn't the type to give up easily. She always was determined, even back in service." Snow considered this, then asked hesitantly, "Voss? Friend once?" The question caught Mason by surprise. "Colleague," he corrected. "Not friend. We served together briefly. She was already moving up the ranks, destined for intelligence." "I was just a field operative. She know about Lissari help?" Mason frowned, considering. "I don't think so, not specifically, but she suspects something doesn't add up about Proxima Centaurea 4. She's right about that much." Snow fell silent again, processing this information. After a while, she pointed to a distant ridgeline. "There. Movement." Mason squinted, following her gesture. His human eyes couldn't detect anything, but he trusted Snow's superior vision. He veered the vehicle into a stand of evergreens, cutting the engine once more. "What did you see?" he whispered. Snow made a gesture indicating bipedal movement. "Two walking, not like you, different." "Not human," Mason translated mentally. "Another species entirely, or humans in environmental suits." Either possibility was troubling. "Change course," he decided. "We'll circle around, approach the bunker from the west instead of the south." Snow nodded her agreement, her expression grave. The simple journey was becoming increasingly complex, the dangers multiplying with each passing hour. Mason updated their navigation, plotting a more circuitous route that would avoid the ridge entirely. As night fell again, they continued their slow progress. The temperature dropped precipitously with the sun, and Mason increased the vehicle's heating to maximum. Snow seemed particularly affected by the cold, her lavender skin taking on a faint bluish tinge that concerned him. "Almost there," he assured her, checking the navigation display. Another hour, maybe less. Snow nodded, pulling the thermal blanket tighter around her shoulders. Then what? It was a good question. Mason had been focused on reaching the bunker safely, but what came after was less certain. "We secure the facility," he said, thinking aloud. "Check the systems. Make sure the landing pad is operational. Then we send the signal to your people. Guide them in." "And after landing?" Snow pressed, her growing vocabulary allowing for more complex questions. Mason hadn't thought that far ahead. What happened after Snow's people arrived? Where would they go? How would they integrate on a planet that considered their very presence illegal? "One problem at a time," he replied, echoing his earlier philosophy. "First, we get there alive." The terrain became increasingly familiar as they approached the bunker's location. Mason had spent 3 months stationed here during the final year of the war, coordinating recon missions from its secure communications center. The facility had been state-of-the-art then, a hidden outpost for coalition special forces operating behind enemy lines. Now, as they crested a final ridge, Mason saw the bunker below, a low, unassuming structure partially embedded in the mountainside. No lights, no signs of occupation, exactly as he had hoped. "There," he pointed. "That's our destination." Snow leaned forward, studying the dark structure with evident curiosity. "Safe?" "Should be," Mason replied, guiding the vehicle down the slope. "Decommissioned 3 years ago, stripped of sensitive technology, but the basic infrastructure should remain intact." He parked the vehicle in a natural hollow about 100 yards from the bunker's main entrance, concealing it as best he could with a camouflage tarp. Snow helped silently, her movements efficient, despite the cold that clearly pained her. "Stay close," Mason instructed as they approached the entrance on foot, his pulse pistol drawn. "If something goes wrong, run for the vehicle. The navigation is preset to return to the cabin." Snow shook her head firmly. "Stay together." Mason didn't argue. They reached the bunker's entrance, a reinforced door set into the mountainside, designed to withstand orbital bombardment. The control panel beside it was dark, as expected. Power would have been cut when the facility was decommissioned. "Manual override," Mason muttered. Kneeling to examine the emergency access panel beneath the main controls, it required a specific sequence of physical inputs, knowledge restricted to those who had served at the facility. The door slid open with a protesting groan of disused mechanisms. Stale air wafted out, carrying the faint metallic scent of a sealed environment. Mason activated his tactical flashlight, illuminating a corridor that stretched into darkness. "Welcome to Outpost Sierra," he said to Snow as they stepped inside. "Home, at least for now." The bunker was eerily silent, their footsteps echoing on metal floors as they moved deeper into the facility. Mason led them directly to the central operations room, a spacious chamber that had once housed dozens of communication stations and tactical displays. Now it stood empty, the equipment removed, only mounting brackets and power outlets indicating what had once been there. "Power first," Mason decided, directing his flashlight toward a door marked Engineering. The facility has its own geothermal generator. Should still be functional unless they physically removed it. The engineering section was largely intact. Coalition military protocol dictated leaving basic life support systems operational even in decommissioned facilities, in case they needed to be rapidly reactivated during a crisis. Mason examined the control panels, thankful for the technical training all Marines received. "Simple enough," he murmured, more to himself than to Snow. "Emergency systems only, minimal power signature, should avoid detection." He initiated the startup sequence, and after several tense moments, the generator hummed to life. Emergency lighting flickered on throughout the facility, casting everything in a soft amber glow. Snow blinked, adjusting to the sudden illumination. "Better," she commented, looking somewhat more comfortable in the bunker's regulated temperature. They explored methodically, Mason's memory of the layout guiding them through a facility designed to house up to 50 personnel. The living quarters were bare, but intact, stripped of bedding and personal amenities but structurally sound. The mess hall contained no food but offered running water when Mason activated the facility's pumps. Most importantly, the communications center, while emptied of its classified equipment, still contained the basic infrastructure needed to modify their transmitter. "This will work," Mason said with cautious optimism. "We can establish a secure signal from here. Guide your people to the landing pad on the roof. The bunker's shielding should prevent detection from orbital scanners." Snow moved to a viewport, looking out at the snow-covered mountains now visible in the moonlight. Her expression was pensive, almost sad. "What is it?" Mason asked, joining her. "Dangerous for you," she said simply. "Help us? Trouble?" Mason couldn't disagree with her assessment. Sometimes trouble finds you whether you're looking for it or not." Snow turned to face him, those black eyes seeming to peer directly into his soul. Why help? Truth. It was a fair question, one Mason had been avoiding since finding Snow in the snow. Why risk everything for aliens he didn't know, connected to a war he'd tried to forget? "Your father saved my life," he said after a long pause. 7 lives, actually. But it's more than that. He struggled to articulate feelings he barely understood himself. The war, what we were told, what we fought for, so much of it was lies, political agendas wrapped in patriotic rhetoric. But what your father did, helping strangers across an interstellar divide, risking everything for what he believed was right, that was real. Snow listened intently, her head tilted slightly as she absorbed his words. "I guess I'm tired of hiding," Mason continued. "Tired of pretending the past doesn't matter. Your people need help, and I'm in a position to provide it. Simple as that." Snow considered his answer, then reached out slowly, placing her cool hand against his chest, over his heart. "Not simple," she said softly. "Brave." The moment stretched between them, a connection that transcended species and language. Mason felt something stir within him, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years. Not quite hope, but perhaps its precursor. The possibility of hope. The moment was shattered by a sudden alarm from the modified transmitter they had brought from the cabin. Snow pulled her hand away as Mason moved quickly to check the device. "Signal," he confirmed, examining the readout. "From orbit, your people. They're early." Snow's eyes widened in alarm. 2 days early. Why?" Mason shook his head. "Could be anything. Pursuit, mechanical issues, opportunity for a safer approach window." He adjusted the transmitter settings. "Regardless, we need to guide them in now. The landing pad isn't prepared." They worked swiftly, Mason establishing power to the rooftop systems while Snow configured the transmitter to communicate with the approaching craft. The bunker had been designed for precisely this type of covert operation, bringing in personnel and equipment without detection, though never for this particular purpose. "Ready," Snow announced, as Mason returned from activating the landing pad's guidance beacons. They sent the signal, a complex sequence of pulses that Snow assured him would be recognized by the Lissari pilot. Now they could only wait and hope the craft could reach them safely. Mason checked his tactical display, monitoring for any sign of coalition patrols in the area. The screen remained clear, but his instincts told him their window of opportunity was narrowing. Major Voss was too thorough, too determined to allow a Lissari incursion to go uninvestigated. "Mason," Snow called from the viewport. "Look." He joined her, following her gaze upward. Against the star-filled sky, a faint light moved in a controlled descent, too steady to be a meteor, too small to be a commercial craft. The Lissari ship, approaching rapidly. "They received our signal," Mason confirmed. "Landing sequence initiated." The craft grew larger as it descended, its design unlike any human vessel Mason had seen. It resembled a teardrop, its surface shifting colors like Snow's clothing, adapting to the night sky for maximum camouflage. It moved with graceful precision, aligning itself with the bunker's rooftop landing pad. As they watched the ship's final approach, a new sound cut through the night, the unmistakable whine of coalition skimmer engines. "No," Snow whispered, her voice tight with fear. Mason's tactical display confirmed his worst fears. 3 signals approaching rapidly from the north. Coalition patrol craft, moving with purpose directly toward the bunker. They detected the ship, Mason realized, or they were already tracking it. Either way, we're out of time. The Lissari craft touched down on the landing pad just as the first coalition skimmer appeared on the horizon, its searchlights sweeping the terrain ahead. "Get to the roof," Mason ordered, grabbing his pulse pistol. "Guide your people inside. I'll delay the coalition forces." Snow gripped his arm, her strength surprising. "No." "Dangerous." "No choice," Mason replied grimly. "Go now." Snow hesitated, conflict visible in her alien features. Then she nodded once and ran toward the access stairwell that led to the roof. Mason moved in the opposite direction, toward the bunker's defensive positions. The facility had been designed with external gun emplacements, nothing that could threaten a military skimmer, but enough to provide a distraction. If he could buy even a few minutes, it might be enough for Snow's people to disembark and take shelter within the bunker's shielded interior. As he reached the control panel for the defensive systems, Mason experienced a moment of clarity. He was about to fire on coalition forces, his former comrades, his own species, to protect aliens he barely knew. It was treason by any definition, the final crossing of a line he had been approaching since finding Snow in the mountain snow. Yet he felt no hesitation, no doubt, only determination. Mason activated the defensive emplacements and opened fire on the approaching skimmers. The coalition response was immediate and overwhelming. The skimmers scattered, adopting evasive patterns that Mason recognized from his own training. Return fire lanced through the night, energy bolts striking the bunker's exterior with concussive force. Mason maintained suppressing fire, targeting the skimmers' sensor arrays rather than their engines or cockpits. He wanted to blind them, not destroy them. These were soldiers following orders, not enemies to be eliminated. The distinction felt important, a line he wasn't willing to cross despite his current actions. Through the bunker's monitoring system, he tracked Snow's progress. She had reached the Lissari craft. The external cameras showed the ship's hatch opening, figures emerging. 4 as expected, moving with the same fluid grace that characterized Snow's movements. They were taller than her, their coloring darker, suggesting age or perhaps gender differences within the species. One of the Lissari stumbled as they disembarked, clearly injured. The others supported their wounded comrade as Snow guided them toward the access hatch. They were vulnerable on the exposed landing pad, silhouetted against the night sky. A coalition skimmer broke through the defensive fire, its searchlight finding the group of aliens. Mason redirected the defensive systems, concentrating all fire on that single craft. The skimmer veered away, but not before its weapon systems locked on. "Snow, down!" Mason shouted into the communication system. On the monitor, he saw Snow react instantly, pulling her people down as energy fire strafed the landing pad. The wounded Lissari was struck, falling to the surface as the others scrambled for cover. Mason abandoned the defensive controls and ran toward the access stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time. He had to reach them to help them inside before the coalition forces regrouped for a coordinated assault. He burst onto the roof, the cold night air a shock after the regulated temperature of the bunker. The scene before him was chaos. 3 Lissari crouched behind a ventilation housing, while Snow knelt beside the fallen 4th, trying desperately to drag them toward safety. "Here!" Mason called, racing across the exposed landing pad, pulse pistol firing at the circling skimmers to provide covering fire. Snow looked up, relief flooding her features as Mason reached her. Together they lifted the wounded Lissari, an older male. His lavender skin darkened to almost black around a severe plasma burn on his torso. "Inside," Mason ordered, supporting most of the aliens' weight as they staggered toward the access hatch. The other 3 Lissari followed, moving in coordinated patterns that spoke of military training. They had almost reached the hatch when the world exploded in light and sound. A direct hit on the landing pad from a coalition heavy weapon. The concussive force threw Mason forward, his body shielding the wounded Lissari as they tumbled through the hatch and down the first few steps. Pain lanced through Mason's left side, shrapnel or energy burns, he couldn't tell. His ears rang from the explosion, the world momentarily reduced to a blur of motion and muffled sound. Hands pulled at him, not human hands. Snow and one of the other Lissari, dragging him and their wounded companion down the stairs as the access hatch automatically sealed behind them, responding to the exterior attack. "Secure! The bunker!" Mason gasped through the pain, military training asserting itself. Lockdown protocols, engineering section. One of the Lissari, taller than Snow, with elaborate markings visible on his face and hands, spoke rapidly in their language. Snow responded, then turned to Mason. He said, "Thank you, go now, secure." The marked Lissari nodded to Mason with evident respect, then moved with military precision toward the engineering section, the third alien following closely. Mason struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the wall. The wounded one. How bad? Snow's expression was grim. Bad. Need medical. They managed to transport the injured Lissari to what had once been the bunker's medical bay. The equipment was gone, but the room still offered clean surfaces and running water. The wounded alien lay utterly still, his breathing shallow, the burn on his torso pulsing with a dark energy that Mason recognized from the battlefield. Plasma weapon damage, severe and potentially fatal. "I have medical supplies in the vehicle," Mason said, calculating the risk. "Basic field kit, but better than nothing." Snow shook her head firmly. "Too dangerous." Coalition outside. As if to emphasize her point, a muffled explosion shook the bunker. Coalition forces attempting to breach the main entrance. The marked Lissari returned, speaking urgently to Snow. She translated for Mason. "Bunker secure. Lockdown complete, but not hold long. Coalition have override codes." Mason nodded grimly. "Of course they do. This is their facility." He considered their limited options. The emergency evacuation tunnel, East Section, Sublevel 2, should lead to an exit 2 miles from here, designed for personnel extraction if the bunker was compromised. Hope flickered in Snow's eyes. Escape possible. "Maybe," Mason hedged, "if the tunnel hasn't collapsed, if they haven't stationed forces at the exit point." He glanced at the wounded Lissari. "And if he can be moved." The third Lissari, female, Mason now realized, with more delicate features than the marked male, knelt beside the wounded one. She placed her hands on either side of his face and closed her eyes in concentration. "What is she doing?" Mason asked quietly. "Healing bond," Snow explained. "Temporary. Give strength, reduce pain." The female Lissari's skin began to glow faintly, a soft luminescence that spread from her hands to the wounded male's body. The dark energy of the plasma burn seemed to recede slightly, the injured alien's breathing becoming more regular. After several moments, the female pulled back, visibly weakened by the effort. The marked male supported her as she swayed, speaking soft words in their language. Snow turned to Mason. "Ready to move now." "HFY." Another explosion rocked the facility, closer this time. The coalition forces were making progress, systematically breaching the bunker's defenses. They had limited time. Mason led them through the bunker's corridors, his military knowledge guiding them toward the emergency evacuation route. The marked male and the recovered female carried their wounded companion between them, moving with synchronized efficiency. Snow stayed close to Mason, her concern evident as she noticed his worsening limp, the injury from the explosion on the landing pad taking its toll. They reached Sub-Level 2, the service corridors narrower and less well lit than the main facility. Mason found the access panel for the evacuation tunnel, hidden behind what appeared to be a standard maintenance hatch. The system required biometric identification, a handprint from authorized personnel. "Let me," Mason said, placing his palm against the scanner. Despite his discharge and the years that had passed, the system recognized him with a soft chime of acknowledgement. The hatch slid open, revealing a long, dark tunnel stretching into the mountain. "Emergency lights only," Mason instructed as they entered the tunnel. Minimal power signature to avoid detection. The tunnel was designed for covert evacuation, narrow, reinforced, and difficult to detect on scanners. It sloped gradually upward, following the mountain's natural contours toward a concealed exit point far from the bunker itself. They moved as quickly as the wounded Lissari's condition allowed, the distant sounds of coalition forces breaching the bunker fading behind them. Mason estimated they had perhaps a 30-minute head start before the coalition discovered the evacuation route. "The vehicle is our best chance once we exit," Mason explained to Snow as they walked. "If we can reach it undetected, it has enough range to get us to the border." "Border?" Snow questioned. "International boundary," Mason clarified. "Outside coalition jurisdiction. Not completely safe, but better odds." The marked Lissari spoke to Snow, his tone questioning. She replied with evident respect, then turned to Mason. "Narath asks, 'Why help? No danger to you.'" Mason glanced at the alien leader, Narath apparently, seeing intelligence and caution in his black eyes. A fair question from someone responsible for his people's safety. "Snow's father saved my life during the war," Mason replied simply. "I'm returning the favor," Snow translated, but Narath seemed unsatisfied with this explanation, speaking again at length. "He say, 'More than debt,'" Snow translated, her eyes on Mason. "Say you fight own people for us." "Why?" Mason walked in silence for several moments, considering his answer. The truth was complex, layered with disillusionment about the war, about the coalition, about the narrative he'd been part of for so long. Because I've seen enough of blind obedience," he finally said. "Enough of following orders without questioning whether they're right. Your people helped mine when it mattered most, despite official policies of neutrality. You chose what was right over what was easy or safe." He met Narath's gaze directly. "I respect that choice. I'm making the same one now." After Snow translated, Narath studied Mason with new intensity, then inclined his head in what seemed to be a gesture of profound respect. He spoke again, his tone solemn. He say, "You are Valkyrie." "Valkyrie," Mason repeated, unfamiliar with the term. "Honored one," Snow explained, "one who sees truth beyond walls." Before Mason could respond, a sound echoed through the tunnel behind them, the unmistakable clang of the access hatch being forced open. The coalition forces had discovered their escape route sooner than expected. "Move faster," Mason urged, ignoring the pain in his side as he increased his pace. "We're almost to the exit." The tunnel began to narrow as it approached the concealed exit point. Mason could see faint light ahead, natural light filtering through the camouflaged outer door. Freedom was tantalizingly close. As they reached the final stretch, Mason activated his tactical display, scanning for coalition signatures outside the exit. What he saw made his heart sink, multiple heat signatures surrounding the exit point. They had been anticipated, the escape route compromised. "Stop," he whispered urgently. "Coalition forces outside." Waiting. The Lissari halted, the injured one making a soft sound of pain despite the healing bond. Narath conferred quickly with the female, then approached Mason, speaking directly to him despite the language barrier. Snow translated, "Narath says, 'Thank you for trying. Will surrender himself. Others escape.'" "No," Mason said firmly. "That's not an option. They'll execute you as an example, use you to justify harsher anti-alien policies." He checked his tactical display again, analyzing the coalition deployment pattern. "There's another way. A distraction." Snow's expression turned to alarm as she understood his meaning. "No, Mason, too dangerous. I'll exit first," Mason continued, ignoring her protest. "Former coalition Marine, confused and injured. They'll focus on me. While they're occupied, you take your people along the eastern ridge. The vehicle is hidden in a hollow about half a mile from here. The navigation system is keyed to my voice, but I've added Snow's voice pattern as well. It will respond to her commands. Come with us," Snow urged, gripping his arm. Mason shook his head. "Someone has to provide the distraction. It has to be me." He looked at each of the Lissari in turn, his gaze lingering on Snow. "Your people need sanctuary. I can give you that chance." Narath spoke again, his tone respectful but firm. Snow hesitated before translating. He say, "Great sacrifice. We'll remember. We'll return for you." Mason managed a grim smile. I'll hold you to that. He turned to Snow, finding it suddenly difficult to meet those bottomless black eyes. Teach them English. Find somewhere safe. Stay together. Snow's silver filament hair rippled with emotion. Mason. Her limited vocabulary seemed to frustrate her as she struggled to express more complex thoughts. I know, Mason said softly. Me too. He removed his tactical display and handed it to her, along with the vehicle's activation key. Then, before he could reconsider, he pressed the exit release and stepped out into the fading light of day. The coalition forces reacted instantly, weapons trained on him as he emerged with hands raised. Sergeant Mason Everett, Coalition Marine Corps, retired, he announced loudly, staggering slightly to emphasize his injuries. What the hell is going on? I was tracking unusual activity in my surveillance area when the bunker was attacked. The coalition soldiers hesitated, confusion evident in their posture. Mason recognized the tactic, standard procedure when confronted with unexpected civilians in a combat zone. He used their moment of uncertainty to move away from the tunnel exit, drawing their attention with him. Who's in command here? He demanded, projecting the confidence of a veteran officer. I want to speak to whoever authorized an attack on a decommissioned coalition facility. As he'd hoped, the soldiers' focus shifted entirely to him, their formation adjusting to surround him rather than secure the tunnel exit. From the corner of his eye, Mason saw movement, so slight it would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. The Lissari, moving with extraordinary stealth along the ridgeline, Snow leading them toward the hidden vehicle. A familiar figure stepped forward from among the coalition forces, Major Diana Voss, her expression a mixture of anger and something that might have been respect. Everett, she said evenly. Somehow I'm not surprised to find you in the middle of this. Middle of what exactly? Mason replied, maintaining his confused facade. I was tracking unusual activity on my surveillance system, part of the Veterans Mountain Watch program. Voss's smile was cold. Save it, Mason. We detected the Lissari ship landing. We tracked your vehicle from your cabin. And we have thermal readings of multiple non-human signatures inside the bunker. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. It's over. Where are they? Mason shrugged, wincing genuinely as the movement aggravated his injury. No idea what you're talking about, Major. I saw coalition skimmers attacking a coalition facility and came to investigate. Got caught in the crossfire. Voss studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Always the hero, Everett. Even when it costs you everything. She gestured to her soldiers. Secure him, full tactical restraints, then sweep the area. The aliens can't have gone far. As the soldiers moved to restrain him, Mason caught a final glimpse of movement in the distance, his vehicle, moving swiftly away through a valley, carrying its precious cargo to safety. He allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction as the restraints clicked into place around his wrists. Try something funny, Sergeant? Voss asked sharply. Just thinking, Mason replied, meeting her gaze without fear. About choices, about what really matters in the end. Voss's expression softened almost imperceptibly. The Lissari helped your squad at Proxima Centauri 4, didn't they? That's what this is about. Mason said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. You know the penalties for what you've done, Voss continued, harboring illegal aliens. Firing on coalition forces, treason during wartime. War's over, Major, Mason corrected. Has been for years. Voss shook her head. Not for everyone, apparently. She signaled to her troops. Take him to the transport. Maximum security protocols. As they led him away, Mason looked up at the darkening sky, wondering if Snow and her people would make it to the border, if they would find the sanctuary they sought. He had done what he could. The rest was up to them, and perhaps in some small way, he had finally made peace with his own past. Snow watched from the ridge as Mason was taken into custody, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Narath urged her forward, his gestures indicating they had limited time to escape. The wounded Lissari, Tarek, Snow's uncle, had stabilized thanks to Lyra's healing bond, but needed proper medical attention soon. Go, Snow said softly in English, more to herself than to her companions. Vehicle near. They reached Mason's all-terrain vehicle without incident, the coalition forces focusing their search in the wrong direction. Snow activated the vehicle as Mason had shown her, the engine humming to life at her command. Narath helped position Tarek in the rear compartment while Lyra kept watch. As they pulled away, following the navigation system's guidance toward the international border, Snow found herself looking back repeatedly as if she might somehow see Mason through the increasing distance and gathering darkness. "Keth Varmor," Narath said gently in their language, a phrase that roughly translated to honor his sacrifice by succeeding. Snow nodded, forcing herself to face forward, to focus on the journey ahead. Mason had given them this chance. She would not waste it. The vehicle moved steadily through the night, its reinforced treads finding purchase in the difficult terrain. Snow drove with careful precision, following exactly the route Mason had programmed, a winding path through valleys and passes designed to avoid detection. Dawn was breaking as they approached the border, a political boundary that existed primarily on maps, marked only occasionally by physical indicators in this remote region. The navigation system chimed softly, indicating they had crossed into neighboring territory. Coalition jurisdiction ended here, replaced by a government with more progressive policies toward non-human species. Snow guided the vehicle to a sheltered location Mason had designated as a safe point. A small cabin, much like his own, apparently owned by someone he trusted. As they approached, a figure emerged from the cabin, human, female, older than Mason, with streaks of silver in her dark hair. "You must be Snow," the woman said, as they stopped before the cabin. "Mason sent a message. Said you might be coming." She looked past Snow to the other Lysari in the vehicle. "Bring your wounded inside. I have medical supplies." Snow hesitated, uncertain whether to trust this unknown human. Narath shared her caution, his hand moving subtly toward a concealed weapon. The woman seemed to understand their hesitation. "My name is Dr. Eleanor Chen. I served with Mason during the war, Medical Corps. He saved my life on Proxima Centauri 4. She held up empty hands. "I owe him. And I disagree with coalition policy on non-human refugees. You're safe here." After a moment's consideration, Snow nodded to Narath. They carefully transported Tarek into the cabin, where Dr. Chen had prepared a medical area, with surprisingly advanced equipment for such a remote location. "Underground network," Dr. Chen explained, as she began treating Tarek's plasma burn. "There are more of us than the coalition knows. Humans who question the official narratives, who remember the truths of the war." As she worked, Dr. Chen explained that Mason had contacted her shortly after finding Snow, establishing contingency plans in case things went wrong. The cabin was one of several safe houses for an organization that helped non-human refugees find sanctuary on Earth, a direct violation of coalition law, but a moral imperative for those involved. "What about Mason?" Snow asked, her limited English struggling to convey her concern. Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. "They'll take him to a military detention facility. The charges will be severe. Treason, most likely. The coalition doesn't forgive those who challenge its authority, especially veterans who should know better." Narath spoke at length, with Snow translating. "He asks if rescue possible. Says Lysari have resources, technology." Dr. Chen considered this carefully. "Possible, but extremely dangerous. It would require coordination, inside help. And it would have to happen before he's transferred to a maximum security facility." She looked directly at Snow. "Why would you risk it? You barely know him." Snow struggled to find the words to explain the connection that had formed between them in their short time together, a bond that transcended species and language. "He saw me," she finally said. "Not alien. Person, worth saving." Understanding dawned in Dr. Chen's eyes. "Yes, that sounds like Mason." She finished treating Tarek's wound, applying a regenerative compound similar to what Mason had used on Snow's leg. "Your friend will recover. The burn was severe, but the damage is repairing itself." As Tarek rested, Snow joined Narath and Lyra outside the cabin. They spoke in their native language, discussing options, possibilities, responsibilities. They were the advance group for more Lysari seeking refuge, the first wave of those who had supported coalition forces in secret during the war, and now faced persecution on their homeworld for their choices. "We must honor Mason's sacrifice," Nareth said. "Continue the mission. Establish sanctuary for our people." "And Mason?" Snow asked, unwilling to abandon the human who had risked everything for them. Nareth's expression softened. "Your bond with him is strong." "I sense it clearly." He glanced at Lyra, who nodded in agreement. "Perhaps there is a way to honor both obligations." They returned to the cabin to find Dr. Chen communicating with someone via a secure channel. She ended the transmission as they entered. "I have news," she said gravely. "Mason is being held at Forward Operating Base Horizon, about 200 miles from here. They're expediting his case, military tribunal rather than civilian court. The coalition wants this handled quickly and quietly." "Timing?" Nareth asked through Snow's translation. 3 days until the tribunal. If convicted, and he will be, immediate transfer to a black site detention facility. After that, extraction becomes nearly impossible." Snow felt a cold determination settle over her. "We help Mason, then continue mission." Dr. Chen studied the Lissari with newfound respect. "You'd risk your freedom, your lives, for one human." "He risked for us," Snow replied simply. "Same choice." Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "I have contacts in the resistance network, people who served with Mason, who remember what really happened at Proxima Centauri 4. It won't be easy, but—" She straightened. "Decision made. We'll need a plan, resources, perfect timing." As they began to strategize, Snow felt something stir within her, a word forming in her mind, a concept that encompassed everything she had experienced since meeting Mason. It wasn't a Lissari word, but an English one, absorbed from her time with him. Yet it resonated with a truth that transcended both their species. Later, as the others rested, Snow stood at the cabin window watching Earth's unfamiliar stars. She practiced the word silently, feeling its shape and meaning, understanding at last what had brought them together across the vast gulf of space. Tomorrow, they would begin the dangerous work of planning Mason's rescue. Tonight, she held the word in her heart like a promise, knowing it would be the first full sentence she would say to him when they met again. A word that had changed everything, from the moment she recognized it in him. Mason sat in his detention cell at Forward Operating Base Horizon, arms resting on the metal table before him. The room was deliberately austere, blank walls, harsh lighting, a single observation camera in the corner. Standard coalition interrogation setup, designed to wear down resistance through sensory deprivation and discomfort. 3 days of questioning had yielded nothing. Mason had maintained the same story throughout. He had detected unusual activity, investigated, and been caught in the crossfire. No mention of Snow, of the Lissari refugees, of his deliberate choice to aid them. The coalition had evidence, of course, the modified communications array, his presence at the bunker, the weapons fire from his position. But without his testimony confirming the presence of the aliens, their case remained circumstantial. The door opened, and Major Voss entered, looking tired but determined. She carried a data tablet and a small recording device, standard equipment for formal questioning. Mason noted the absence of guards, unusual protocol for a prisoner charged with treason. "Final session, Everett," Voss said, taking the seat opposite him. "Tribunal convenes tomorrow at 800. This is your last chance to cooperate, to explain your actions." Mason met her gaze steadily. "Nothing to explain, Major. I've told you what happened," Voss sighed, setting down the tablet. Then, surprisingly, she reached up and deactivated the observation camera. The red recording light blinked out. "Off the record, Mason," she said, her voice dropping. "I've reviewed all the files on Proxima Centauri 4, the official reports, your squad's debriefing, the tactical analysis. None of it adds up. Your squad should have died in that mining complex. There was no possible escape route, no way for 7 Marines to penetrate enemy lines without detection." Mason remained silent, watching her carefully. "Then I found this," Voss continued, sliding the tablet toward him. "Buried in classified archives, security level beyond my official clearance, a transmission intercept, partial only, from an unknown source to your squad's emergency frequency. Navigation data, Enemy positions, a safe extraction route. Mason glanced at the display, recognizing the data that had saved his squad all those years ago. Snow's father's transmission. The source was never identified, Voss said. Never officially acknowledged, but analysis confirmed it wasn't from any coalition unit. The encryption pattern was alien. Interesting theory, Mason commented neutrally. Not a theory, a fact. Voss leaned forward. The Lysari helped your squad, didn't they? Violated their own neutrality to save coalition marines, and now they're being persecuted for it on their homeworld, seeking asylum on the very planet whose government refuses to acknowledge their assistance. Mason's expression remained impassive, though internally he was reassessing the woman before him. If that were true, it would be quite an indictment of coalition policy. Yes, it would. Voss sat back. There are people in the coalition who remember the truth of the war, Mason. People who know that the official narrative is incomplete at best, deliberately falsified at worst. People who believe we owe a debt to those who helped us, regardless of species. People like you? Mason asked, allowing skepticism to color his tone. Voss met his gaze directly. My brother was in your squad, Sergeant. Lieutenant Carl Voss. He never told me directly what happened at Proxima Centauri 4. Couldn't, given the classification level. But he left records, encrypted files that were to be released to me if anything happened to him. Recognition dawned in Mason's eyes. Carl. He was our tactical officer. He died last year, civilian transport accident. Not an accident, Voss said quietly. He was investigating the truth about Lysari involvement in the war. Getting too close to classified information the coalition wanted buried. Mason felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. You're saying he was eliminated? I'm saying there are factions within the coalition who will go to extreme lengths to maintain the official narrative. Voss glanced at the deactivated camera. The same factions who are pushing for your tribunal to be closed, your sentence carried out immediately. No appeal process. Why are you telling me this? Mason asked, suspicious of this sudden revelation. Voss stood, straightening her uniform. Because in 12 hours, you'll be transferred to the tribunal chamber in the East Wing. The transport route takes you through a maintenance corridor that has a 3-second blind spot in the security coverage. A glitch that's been reported but never fixed due to budget constraints. She moved to the door, then looked back at him. 3 seconds isn't much time, Everett, but for someone with your training, it might be enough. Are you suggesting I try to escape? That's a death sentence if I'm caught. I'm not suggesting anything, Voss replied coolly. I'm simply informing a prisoner about a security vulnerability, as is my duty as the facility's intelligence officer. What you do with that information is your concern. She reactivated the camera. For the record, the prisoner continues to be uncooperative. Recommend maximum security protocols for tomorrow's transfer. With that, she exited, leaving Mason alone with this unexpected information and the faint, dangerous flicker of hope. Throughout the night, Mason considered Voss's revelation. It could be a trap, designed to justify harsher treatment or even summary execution if he attempted escape. Or it could be genuine, a covert offer of help from someone who shared his disillusionment with coalition policy. Either way, it represented his only chance. Once the tribunal convicted him, a foregone conclusion, he would disappear into the coalition's black site detention system. No appeals, no visitors, no possibility of rescue. Morning came too quickly. 2 guards entered his cell, securing his hands with magnetic restraints before escorting him from the detention block. Mason noted every detail of their route, mapping the facility in his mind, identifying potential escape routes, assessing the guards, alertness and weapon readiness. Old habits that had kept him alive through 3 tours of duty. They approached a narrow maintenance corridor, exactly as Voss had described. 1 guard entered a security code, and the door slid open. Mason counted his steps, remembering Voss's words, a 3-second blind spot in security coverage. As they reached the midpoint of the corridor, a distant alarm sounded. Both guards tensed, their attention momentarily diverted toward the sound. Mason didn't hesitate. 3 seconds. 1, a backward step, positioning himself precisely between the guards. 2, A sharp movement, bringing his restrained hands up and around the nearest guard's neck, using the magnetic field of the restraints to disrupt the neural implant all coalition soldiers wore at the base of their skull. 3. As the first guard collapsed, Mason used the momentary advantage to execute a precise strike against the second guard's temple with his elbow, enough force to render unconscious, not enough to cause permanent damage. Both guards down, Mason quickly located the restraint release on the first guard's belt, freeing his hands. He dragged the unconscious men into a maintenance alcove, swapping his prisoner's jumpsuit for the second guard's uniform. It wasn't a perfect fit, but it would have to do. The alarm continued to sound, not for him, he realized, but for some other security breach. A distraction, perhaps deliberately triggered. Mason didn't wait to find out. He moved through the corridor with purpose, adopting the confident stride of coalition personnel going about their duties. The maintenance corridor led to a service area near the facility's vehicle bay, a vulnerable point in security designed for the rapid movement of supplies and equipment. Mason navigated through the increasing chaos as personnel responded to the mysterious alarm, keeping his head down, avoiding direct eye contact with anyone he passed. He reached the vehicle bay just as a remarkable coincidence occurred, or what seemed like coincidence, until Mason noticed the precision of the timing. A power fluctuation hit the bay, causing the security doors to cycle open as emergency protocols activated. Standing orders required the doors to default to open during power disruptions, allowing personnel to evacuate if necessary. Mason slipped through the momentary gap, emerging into the outdoor vehicle staging area. Coalition personnel moved with urgency around him, responding to the facility-wide alert. No one paid attention to a single soldier moving purposefully toward the perimeter. He had almost reached the outer fence when a skimmer landed directly in his path. Mason tensed and preparing to fight or flee, when the hatch opened to reveal a familiar face, Dr. Eleanor Chen, wearing the uniform of a coalition medical officer. "Get in," she ordered briskly. "Medical emergency evacuation." Mason complied without hesitation, ducking into the skimmer as alarm klaxons began to sound across the base, his absence discovered. The hatch sealed behind him, and the skimmer lifted immediately, accelerating away from the facility with the distinctive urgency of a medical transport. "Cutting it close, Eleanor," Mason commented as he secured himself in the passenger seat. "Complicated extraction, Doctor," Chen replied, her hands steady on the controls as she guided the skimmer into a cloud bank, engaging stealth systems. "Multiple security levels to bypass. You can thank your alien friends for the technical assistance." Mason's heart jumped. "Snow, the others." "Safe," Dr. Chen assured him, "and remarkably determined to rescue you, despite the risks to themselves. The young one, Snow, was particularly insistent." Relief washed over Mason, followed by concern. "How the Coalition will hunt for us, all of us. There's nowhere on Earth we can hide long-term." Dr. Chen smiled enigmatically. "Who said anything about staying on Earth?" The skimmer broke through the cloud cover, climbing rapidly to an altitude usually reserved for orbital transports. Below, Mason could see Coalition pursuit craft scrambling, but they were already too far behind, their sensors confused by the specialized countermeasures installed in Dr. Chen's modified skimmer. "Where are we going?" Mason asked as Earth's surface receded beneath them. "Rendezvous point," Dr. Chen replied. "Your Lissari friends have been busy. Apparently, they have connections off-world, sympathizers who've arranged transport to a sanctuary colony beyond Coalition jurisdiction." Mason absorbed this information, the implications dawning gradually. "You're coming too. Someone has to provide medical support for a mixed-species refugee group," she replied with a shrug. "Besides, the Coalition was getting too close to our underground network. Time for a fresh start, somewhere new." The skimmer continued its ascent, until Earth's curvature became visible on the horizon. Then, as they reached the upper atmosphere, a ship appeared above them, not Lissari design, but something else entirely. It extended a docking tube, creating a secure airlock for their transfer. "Last chance to change your mind," Dr. Chen said as they prepared to board. "Once we dock, there's no going back." Mason looked out at the planet below. the only home he had ever known, now become a place where he could never safely return. He thought of his cabin in the mountains, the solitude he had sought there, the life he had built for himself after the war, a life of isolation and regret, of hiding from the truths he had glimpsed during his service. Then he thought of Snow, her courage, her trust, the connection that had formed between them despite every barrier of species and language and history. "No," he said with quiet certainty. "No going back." They docked with the waiting ship, transferring quickly from the skimmer that had been their escape craft. Inside, Mason found a vessel of unfamiliar design, spacious, advanced, crewed by a species he didn't recognize. Tall, crystalline beings moved with fluid grace through curved corridors that seemed to have been grown rather than constructed. And waiting for him in the central chamber were the Lisari, Narath, Lyra, Tarek, now recovered from his injuries, and Snow, her black eyes finding his immediately as he entered. She stepped forward, those eyes holding his with an intensity that transcended their biological differences. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the human and the alien, connected by choices made and unmade, by sacrifices offered and accepted. Then Snow spoke, not the isolated English words she had used before, but a complete sentence, clearly practiced, perfectly pronounced, and filled with meaning that bridged the vast gulf between their worlds. "Humanity," she said, "is not where you're born, but what you choose to protect." Mason felt the truth of it resonate through him, the understanding that had been growing since he found her in the snow. That connection, compassion, and courage defined one's humanity far more than species or origin. That in choosing to protect Snow and her people, he had reclaimed the best part of himself, the part that the war and its aftermath had nearly destroyed. "Yes," he agreed simply, crossing the space between them to take her offered hand, human fingers intertwining with alien ones in a gesture that defied everything the coalition had taught about separation and difference. "That's exactly right." As the ship disengaged from Earth's orbit, accelerating toward distant stars and the promise of sanctuary, Mason felt the weight of isolation lift from his shoulders. He had lost his home but found his humanity, in the eyes of an alien, in the words she had spoken, in the choices that had brought them together across the vast emptiness of space, and somehow that seemed like more than a fair exchange.